Next, we are going to create one more object, cursor, cursor. Already we established connection. Data is stored in OB object, right? So we are going to use OB object because it is having a details of connection, right? So here we are going to use one more function called cur cursor. This function will help us to fetch the data row by row. We are using this cursor function. So its details will be stored in left side cursor. First step, we have to import mysql.connector. Second step, we have to create object. Left side, right side, we have to use connect function to establish connection between mysql and python. So after connection established, checking connection is optional. Okay, after checking the connection, we have to create one more object, right, by using cursor function. So inside cursor function, no need to give any parameters. We can give empty parameter, we can give only brackets, right? So already we created object cursor. Totally we created two objects, okay, OB object and cursor object. One is OB, another one is cursor, right? So next step, we are going to execute mysql query. From Python, we are going to execute mysql commands. So for that, we are going to use cursor object. Inside cursor object, by using cursor object, we can use execute function. Particular execute function execute mysql command from Python. So it's very important. Inside execute function, within double quotes, so here we can give a query, select star from table name. My table name is employee. Invalid syntax. So we'll give only command. Again, we'll give same command. So now it is working. So all the data will be stored in cursor now. So we have to store the data in a local variable. So here I am going to create a variable called data. So after executing the query, so we have to store the data in a Python. So that's why in left hand side we are creating variable, right? Right hand side we are going to use again cursor dot. So this time I'm going to use fetch all function. So fetch all function will help us to fetch all the data from cursor. So all the data are stored in cursor, from cursor, not from the MySQL. So cursor dot execute function will fetch all the data from cursor and gives to data. So local variable. So the data variable will have all the data from employee. So we fetched all the data from MySQL and we stored in data. So next we want to execute, we want to print the data retrieved from the MySQL. So for that we are going to use for I in data because we are having multiple row data. So if you want to display multiple row data, we have to use for loop print I. So to understand this, you need a knowledge of for loop, how for loop is works. Okay, what is the purpose of using in, what is the purpose of using I. If you don't know what is for loop, the concept is difficult to understand. Wow. So full table data are displayed here. So we fetch all the data from MySQL. Instead of using fetch all, if you are using fetch one, if you are using fetch all function, it will fetch all the records in a particular table. Let's see if you are using fetch one function. So here what it tells you, there is no multiple rows. If you don't have multiple rows, is directly you can print a data instead of using for loop. So what you are going to do, you are going to print data directly instead of using for loop. None. Why we are getting none? It is why it is not showing a single row, because already we executed select star from employee. All the data from this particular table is already fetched. So there is no data to fetch. So that's why it is showing none. So what we have to do, we have to execute particular query again. We have to use execute function again. So Again we use the execute function. So all the data is stored in cursor. Then we are going to use fetch function. Then we'll try to print. Now you can see that previously we used the same queries, we got none. But now we are getting first row of data. Because if you execute a query, the data will be stored in cursor object, right? So after storing a values in a cursor, okay, we used fetch all function to store the data into local variable here, right? Then we printed all the datas. Okay, there is no data in cursor. Again, if you are using cursor.fetch1, there is no data. Okay, that's why we got none here. What we have to do every time, if you want a result, every time we have to execute mysql query before you trying to print a data. So after executing a query, you can use any one, fetch all or fetch one, right? So here I am using fetch one after executing a query, and we store the data in a data variable. Then we use directly print function because it is not having a multiple row, only one row of data. If it is having a multiple row, we have to use for loop, right? So we learned how to retrieve a data and display them by using fetch one function and fetch all function. So next we are going to learn row count. So how many rows of data are stored in a particular table? If you want to count the number of rows of data we fetched, right? So for that, what we have to do? We have to execute a query again by using execute function. Error. After doing many process, so it is showing error. So what we have to do? We have to close the path. We have to close the connection. Then again we have to establish the connection. We created connection by using what? Connect function, right? So what we have to do? We have to use ob.close, right? So what we did? We closed the establishment. So what we have to do? We have to restart again. So first step is we have to connect mysql and python using connect function. Okay, so again we established connection. Then what we have to do? We have to use cursor function to create cursor object because it will help us to fetch row by row data. So first step, second step is over. Third step, we have to execute the query by using execute function. So it's done. Next, we have to create local variable, and by using fetch all function, we are going to store all the data in local variable. So the data is a local variable. It is having whole data which is available inside a employee table, right? So next, what we are going to do? We are going to count how many rows of data stored in data variable, right? So for that, we are going to create one more variable count count equal to right hand side. We are going to use cursor dot row count. You know that already cursor object is having a whole data. So by using cursor object, store only number of rows, how many number of rows we fetched from employee table, right? If you print a data variable, you will get the number of rows which we retrieved from employee table. If you print count function, it will give you how many number of rows retrieved from the employee, right? So first we will print the data by using for loop. So these many rows are there. Okay. So next we will print. So it will show you how many rows are there. So totally 20 rows of data we retrieved from MySQL. So finally, we are going to use Fetchmany function. So to use Fetchmany function, what we have to do? We have to execute query using execute function. Again, we have to use execute function again to execute query. Next step, instead of using fetch all, you can use fetch many. So here, how many number of rows of data? So you know that already 20 number of rows of data stored in employee table. So if you want only 5 rows, starting from 5 rows, right? So you can use Fetchmany and you can give the size, right? How many rows? If you want 5 rows, you can give 5. If you want only 3 rows, you can give 3. So here I am giving 5, right? Again, I'm going to use for loop to display data because it is having multi-row variable. So you can see that only 5 rows were displayed here because we used fetch many. Inside fetch many, we gave 5 as input. Okay, so the fetch many function will fetch only 5 rows of data from cursor object.